Hello, everyone. I'm thrilled to be able to join you all to moderate this talk about technology PR with Lucinda Shen, who is a noted technology and venture capital reporter for Fortune. You might know Lucinda best as the author of the daily Tech Deals newsletter Term Sheet, but you might not know that she's actually moving on from Fortune in a couple of weeks to cover fintech for a rival news publication, Axios. So I guess first, welcome, Lucinda, and second, early congratulations on your new position.
Yes, thank you. I'm really excited. Yes, it's really interesting joining a competitor.
Exactly. And the other thing I haven't mentioned, but which we learned during our tech setup, is that Lucinda is in, I think, day 20 of her COVID quarantine in Hong Kong, where she's visiting before she starts her new job. So anyway, we can send her some tips on quarantine life. But before we delve into Fortune versus Axios and what makes a great tech story, I've kind of always thought that the one way for companies to get better press coverage is really to understand more about what being a tech journalist is like and the demands of that job. So maybe you can talk to us a little bit about what exactly a day in the life of a tech journalist is like. Specifically one covering startups or VC. I know the job has changed a lot since I was doing it 12 or 13 years ago, and I have to think it's even more demanding today given the market.
Yeah, I think 100% you're right. I think we're at kind of record levels of venture capital dollars, and that comes with record levels of announcements as well from both venture capitalists and their startups as well. I can't necessarily speak for every single tech reporter, but I do think my experience does speak to the wider trend. So I can tell you how my day looks like. So I effectively usually, when I'm not in Hong Kong, wake up at 7 a.m., or rather I start working at 7 a.m. And I start compiling basically every single deal that is happening that I can see, at least both incoming from emails and from the online news sites that are in the venture community or within PE, or just in the broader scope of, maybe it's Zoom buying a company, or Google buying someone, because it's a value to deal makers. That has definitely that job has gotten a lot more aggressive and a lot more demanding over the past year alone, just as we've gone from kind of deal making that was a result of pandemic panic to deal making that's now a result of people trying to figure out what the new world looks like. And everyone is capital right now. So it's just been a really crazy time. At the same time, the second trend that's happening, I feel like, is there's a lot of tech journalists who are leaving, journalists in general, who are leaving the industry. And so you're seeing people who are leaving for the venture capital industry. You're seeing people leaving to become PR representatives, as well as just any number of jobs, really. So you're seeing kind of a really bizarre market dynamic where there's just so many deals that there aren't enough people to cover it. And that much is true not only for me, but also for I think anyone who's writing for TechCrunch. You'll see on Twitter, like, it's just the great moan of pain from all the tech journalists that Tuesdays are just the worst days possible, because everyone wants to announce their deals then. And so yes, the timing has definitely gotten more aggressive. So like I remember Rebecca, you asked me, I think, how many emails I get, and I was looking at it. I get approximately 1 to 2 emails a minute, and that's 24 hours on a 24-hour basis. And that's not like spam emails, that's emails that I have to be checking.
Right. From people you might even know, right, who are trying to pitch
From people I might even know. Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this is so, and so you, in some ways, we should talk about how you kind of do two things in this current job that you're, moving on from. So you're compiling this daily newsletter where, if you get funding, it's likely that you're going to get a couple of sentences, but you also get pitched. Like, I talk to you sometimes about bigger picture stories, like, oh, do you want to interview this person? Are you interested in this theme? When it comes to those kinds of pitches, it's a complex question, and we'll probably talk about this from quite a number of aspects, but like, how do you decide what to cover? How do you decide what to write about and what makes a good story?
Yeah. So my way of thinking about it, so even though I'm going off to cover fintech, which is a lot more focused, my mandate within this newsletter, because it's deal making, is to make it as interesting as possible, which means I'm hoping that even if you are within fintech, that I'm bringing something new to you, maybe about the space economy, or maybe about the trends that are happening within ag tech, something to make you go, oh, that was interesting. That was something that I didn't know before. And so in that sense, that's one thing, right? So one pitch, I think one way that people pitch us as reporters is they go, oh, this person covered Robinhood, they'll cover us as another stock brokerage company as well. Or, oh, they'll cover this news again. I don't think that's always the best way of going about it. It can be sometimes, but for my particular newsletter currently, it's not, because if I've already covered it, I don't want to cover it again. There's no point to that. It's not new. There's nothing there for my readership.
I think that's a
thing.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Go ahead. I'm just going to follow up on that.
No, go on.
Yeah, I think that's a super important point, because I see a lot of startups do this. They're like, oh, well, she just wrote about this topic and we do this, so I'm going to pitch her. And the answer 99% of the time is, I'm not writing about that again anytime soon because I just did it. Right. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah.
Right,
and that's like the thing, if you're being like, we all hate routine, we hate repetitive jobs. I feel like that's why there's been a huge like shift towards automation, right? The same thing is happening here. Like, we don't want to write the same story again. No one wants to read the same story again. And it's always a challenge, because you might not think it's the same story, but it often is.
Right.
Because there's like, the same story repeats itself for 20 years because of microcycles. The same story, every single founder also generally often has the same way of pitching reporters a lot of the times. Which means it's like 1 out of every 60 pitches maybe is good. So because everyone believes that they have a really good company, and they usually do, but the way that they market themselves is not always the most efficient. And so I've seen people, that's when you get into the problem of using words that overemphasize the company, but fall into these like pitfalls of being just repetitive and the same thing over and over again. So like leading, like, oh, we're innovative, we're like a SaaS company, we're in the metaverse, like all these different things. They're all buzzwords, but we have no idea what it means, right? Like, just tell us what you do. That's all we want to know.
Yeah, no, I think that's another important point. And one that I talk about with our portfolio companies at Battery all the time is that you can use these jargony words in your sales focused marketing, when you're trying to attract customers, because they know what that means. But if they're trying to get coverage in a Fortune, an Axios, or even to a large degree a TechCrunch. I don't know what you think about that. I feel like TechCrunch is kind of a hybrid publication where it's kind of techy, but it's kind of high level at the same time. You have to spell it out. I always say, like, why do we care? Why are you important?
Yeah.
I mean, do you have any tips specifically for companies on breaking out? Because I'm guessing like you might get, 15 pitches for companies raising a $10 million Series A every day, so how do they break out from that pack?
Yeah. So I would say there's more of you guys than there is of us as journalists. So definitely, make sure to target. One of the biggest mistakes I see founders make is when you're sending me something that is irrelevant to me. I'll like nicely send back a message being like, sorry, this isn't for us. Don't fight me on it. I know what it might be. But sometimes, like, so if someone does cover fintech more broadly, pitch that towards them. If they have a tendency to pitch, to cover things like health tech, pitch towards them instead of, I sometimes get things about like hospitality, which is fun, like about hotels, for example, right? So I cover like hospitality, venture capital, but I don't cover like hotels. I don't cover what's happening more broad. Like I don't cover the new launch of a hotel for Wynn Resorts, for example. I think that's one mistake, just like missing the mark on who you should be targeting. And the second one I would say is oftentimes, like in terms of money can be a differentiator in the marketing front, right? If we see larger dollars, it's a signal for us to venture capitalists as well to some extent that you are doing something that probably is getting traction in the market. It's a little harder to tell nowadays, now that everyone's kind of getting thrown in $1 billion valuation for just being around or for just like getting more money. You get more money for getting more money at this point. But there's still value, it seems like, in having unicorn status or being able to double that. And so that is one marker for us. The other one is if you just have an interesting story. Oftentimes I'm hearing from you via word of mouth. That's what I found to be one of the most valuable ways of understanding what's working in the market and what's interesting. Someone else who's like genuinely just sitting down and telling their story rather than marketing it to me as kind of a reporter and packaging it with all those verbs and words again that make me go, well, I've seen this again 1 billion times.
Yeah, interesting. So I have a follow up on that, but I would just want to put the word out there for conference attendees. If you have specific questions for Lucinda, please send them in via the chat, and we'll make sure to get to those. I think we've got about 20 more minutes, but I know on this topic I traditionally get a ton of questions, so please do send them in.
Yeah. I guess if it's, I'm sorry. The one thing I didn't say, I'm sorry, I've been talking kind of in high level, so it might be helpful. I got a pitch recently that was, in my opinion, really good, right? It wasn't about money. It wasn't even about the investor in particular or the people who were on the team, which also helped, but it was about, it's funny, like the same markers that tell a VC that the company is interesting or worth taking a meeting with are often the same markers that the journalists use as well. I think that we're all a lot of us are trying to make a concerted effort to like try different avenues and different signals as well, because otherwise you're falling into the same pitfall of covering the same stuff and over and over and again. But I did get a really good pitch from someone recently who is doing PR, and she basically pitched me understanding that who my audience is, right? And my audience and my goal is to make sure that the story is getting out to a wider set of people, that it's not just within the venture community, that people are reading this in like college and deciding that they want to be in this industry, or like, or your grandma's reading it and beginning to understand what crypto is about. So from that perspective, she pitched me on a startup by basically saying, oh, this company is trying to help the normal average person do what Peter Thiel does and avoid taxes. And it's like a very clicky headline, but it's also a really good way. It was a really good way of like delivering the message, delivering what the news is today, which is how the news works today, which is often via these big words, these big names. And the company itself only raised about like 6 million, right? So it definitely was a newer company. There weren't a whole lot of signals around at the time.
So a good story can trump a small fundraising amount, a small number, if it's a company. Yeah. Right.
And I think the pitch also understood, right, that there was a wider, broader theme to cover in a different and new way.
Exactly. You mentioned before kind of packaging up a pitch, and this particular pitch came from a PR person. I get the question a lot of times from founders like, well, should I leave this to a professional PR person? Does that look inauthentic? Would it be more authentic if I sent the email or pitched the journalist myself? I mean, there's pros and cons to both of those, right? Like, what do you have a view on that? And do you prefer one over the other?
Yeah, hilariously, I do have a tendency to take emails more directly if they're from the founder themselves, right? Because it's always a little bit odd to have this added layer of a relationship where you really just want to be direct. And then there's kind of this like official artificiality to it, of the added layer of like, there is a PR person that is, their job is generally there to make sure that their client is coming off as clean as possible. That said, there's like loads of PR people that I absolutely love. Rebecca's fantastic, obviously. Other PR people that the other person that I was mentioning. And like, but that said, I think there is generally a preference for a direct relationship throughout journalism. Right. So it does help. That said, I think one challenge I've noticed is that when you are, and I don't know the profile of the people on this call, but if you're in the early stages and you've never done PR before, you've never had contact with journalists before, and this is quite common, I'm getting a lot of direct pitches, but they don't really understand like journalistic rules. And so they'll send me things that are not under embargo, but they mean that it is under embargo, and they send it to me, right? And usually that means that I, as a journalist, can just like throw it out there like 2 weeks before you plan to announce it, because you've given me the news without actually agreeing to put it on background or telling me as like a heads up, right? And so those kinds of things, you have to like, it makes the relationship a little harder. Like if I'm not going to take the pitch, I tell them, hey, this is not how journalism works, just as a heads up. Right. But those kinds of things, those mistakes, I can see the potential of those mistakes happening and having kind of worse effects. And so in that sense, I believe that having a PR professional is really effective.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. And we still see this happening, right? And people, founders in the audience may not know the difference, but when you embargo a piece of news, that means I'm giving it to you ahead of time, But before you actually give the piece of news and tell the reporter what it is, they have to proactively agree to the embargo, which might be, hey, we're going to run this out a week from Friday. That's when we're doing our big launch. That's when we're going to, write this blog post and post it on our website. But you can't send the news and then say it's under embargo, because once it's out, right? And I think different journalists have would come down harder, right, on that than others. Some might say, well, your mistake. Some might take pity on somebody who didn't know the rules. So
yeah. So I do have a lot of empathy for her, because the challenge with a lot of these is like, there is no blanket law in journalism that says all organizations are going to take embargoes in this particular way. Especially within tech journalism, it's a lot more strict between like the government. Like there's reporters that cover the Fed. They have very strict relationships with the Fed. So you can get fired for breaking embargo, and you kind of automatically agree to an embargo when you're kind of in that beat. Not the same for tech journalism. So it's quite, it is a very, I have a lot of empathy, I think, for startup folks who are newer to dealing with like this weird world.
Exactly. So we did have one question come in over the chat from Rianne, and she asked, how would you recommend pitching an early stage startup that doesn't have news in quotes, but is more mission based? I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that. I think there has to be some news or angle or reason to cover the company, but we are seeing more and more companies that are focused on climate change, ESG things. Any thoughts on that? I don't know if you write a lot about companies in that area.
Yeah, I'm not sure what you mean by mission-based, if that is like climate change or whatnot. If that is the case, I mean, you do need news. You really do need news. You need some kind of hook to it. That's really the only way you'll get covered. You need, okay, if it's not money, right? Maybe your founder or one of your founders is from Google. Maybe one of them is from the the doomed Kleiner Perkins original climate change fund from back in like 2006. Maybe they're like BFFs with Al Gore. Even if they don't have money, you need some kind of hook for it to be news. Or you need to be doing something really original. It's a little hard for me to evaluate in this particular case because I just don't know what you're doing. The other thing I would say, I think mission driven is probably falling into one of those categories of being a bit of a buzzword. To give you a less savory example of that, DWAC, the company that is taking Trump's back. Oh, sorry, the Trump's back effectively, right? The one that's taking Trump's like Truth Social company public. On page 3 of their prospectus, they call themselves mission driven. So it's one of those terms that gets co-opted, like sustainability or any of those terms, right? That then gets really, it gets a little messy. So I would say if you're pitching a journalist, probably be a little more precise with what you mean and maybe not use that particular term.
Yeah.
You're welcome to, but definitely like at least elucidate.
Sure. One other topic I wanted to talk about, startups today and tech companies, because of the explosion of social media and blogging and different platforms, they have a lot of different options now as far as getting their message out. In the old days, it used to be all media relations. If I'm a company of any size, I'm pitching reporters, I'm putting out press releases. Now we see CEOs, choosing to do a blog post maybe instead of press release. Maybe they'll do a tweet storm. They'll write something on LinkedIn, or you've got competitors that have left traditional publications to go to Substack, and they're writing newsletters and they're doing great. I mean, do you feel, how do you view that balance? And do you think sometimes there are situations or how would you counsel CEO to say, you know what, maybe you don't need me for this. I'm not the appropriate audience for you. I don't know how you view that.
No, 100%. So I view this, and I don't know if this is getting a little too nerdy. I look at this in the same way that I think late stage venture investors and late stage bankers and startups look at like the options between IPOs, SPACs, and direct listings. They can all be legitimate, and those being the same thing as, your options between the Substack writers, a direct blog post, a traditional media company like my own, or even a new media company that is trying something new like Axios. The thing that I would say is there are definitely cases where you're better served like throwing out the news on your own. The challenge is you need to know your own reach and your own ability. And so if you're someone like Stripe, like the Collison brothers, or if you're even someone like Li Jin over at Atelier, and she just recently moved over into another firm by combining that investing shop. But basically, if you're one of those people that have a built-in relationship with their audience, you can literally announce to, you can announce solely by yourself. And that's what Li Jin did, right? Li Jin, who is like the it girl of the creator economy investing world, she went to a Substack writer to basically put her announcement of her $12 million fund up. It's a little different, I think, for Stripe, where they're still, my senses, right, is that they are still served by telling the wider public where they are, if they are raising a fund or raising another round, because they are, yes, predicated largely on the younger crowd of startups, but they also will be served in the future by getting their news out there to older companies and older people in more established industries. And that's also kind of where a company like Fortune or the Wall Street Journal can really help them with a broader reach beyond Twitter, beyond Substack. So it just, yes, there are places where you're well served. There are places where you should probably consider, but basically the bottom line is you have a lot of choices. Think about them well. Just consider where you stand in the world. If you're like an enterprise startup, if you're like a developer-based startup, I'm probably not the best person to go to. If you're a consumer-based startup, maybe I'm a better person to go to because we're speaking more broadly to consumers. So it's definitely something that you have to think about in the same way that you probably think about your go-to-market strategy.
Right. And a question just came in over the chat, I think, following it up on that from Marina. She said, do you pay attention to blogs and social media stories shared by companies? I'm not sure exactly.
I do.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I do. That is how the downside to that is, as a tech journalist, you kind of have to be you have to be keyed in. So that's the thing, right? I don't know what the end goal for this for you is, or if you're thinking about maybe writing a blog post and that's why you're asking this question. But so I'm not going to be representative of the wider public if that's your eventual reach. If you're trying to get to a journalist, yes, that writing a blog post can get you attention. Writing blog posts is how a lot of writing smart things on Twitter, writing inflammatory things on Twitter in some cases, is how a lot of people have built their brand, quite frankly. It gets you a lot of attention, it gets you fans, it gets you deals, it gets you journalist attention. The flip side to that is, if you're going to announce information about yourself, if you're raising a funding round, right, you're coming out of stealth or whatever it may be, and you are trying to get a journalist attention by writing a blog post, and you're including that round in there, that news is already a little bit boring to us because it's already out there. The value of it is a little less interesting. There's definitely still people who are going to write about it, but for me personally, I prefer a story that hasn't been written about, that I can at least break on my own.
Right. One thing that I think is kind of implied in what you've been saying and answering the last couple of questions too, is it's important for companies, because any company will get really in the weeds on its own technology, right? Because they're the ones that built it. And that it's also important for them to kind of connect what they're doing to, let's say, higher level technology trends. Like I counsel our companies about this a lot, like, well, because there's now hybrid work and no one is going to the office, this is creating more demand for your X technology because of that. I mean, is that something that you see a lot, or that can make an impact for you? Because often I see that's where startups stumble, that they get so in the weeds with their jargon and their technology, they're not thinking through the big picture enough to pitch you.
Yeah, so there's like a secret formula that I don't think any of us often.
Oh my gosh.
There is a secret formula in journalism writing, which is, when you're writing about this, oftentimes when you're writing about the startup, part of it is, or any kind of situation, you want to be writing about a larger context. And so when you're writing about any kind of startup, really, and there is, every startup is original, yes, but it is happening not in a vacuum. It is happening around the people in Silicon Valley or the people in Utah or whatever. And so, yes, there's always a larger trend. And I believe that is helpful to include. So, if it's a startup that's like just happening, and for the first unicorn in West Virginia, awesome. That's great. That's fantastic. That's not a trend. That is a great marker though. So that can, there's that pitch that goes against the trend story. But then if you're a company that is raising a few $1 million and you're seeing this larger issue with, for example, let me think, maybe something like robotic processing automation companies are not doing too well, and they themselves need more automation. And so that's a trend. You write up, maybe you pitch it on that level. So yes, there are ways. Basically putting it in context can be very helpful. The challenge is definitely though, like once the trends hit a zenith. So for example, like the Great Resignation has hit a point where it's like kind of stopped. It's harder to find, like you now need to find new ways of writing about it. The challenge is finding what the new grasp is, not the Great Resignation, which that story came out like months and months ago.
Right. It's sort of like, we've got companies that are playing into the whole supply chain disruption thing, but that story is becoming old, right? You almost need a new angle on that now.
Totally. If, the startup has a particular anecdote about how it's helping with a supply chain crisis, if it's innovating in a really interesting way on the West Coast, that leads to this issue not being an issue in the future, like all these different things. There's different angles to it, but yeah, for sure.
Yeah. You mentioned, we talked about geography a minute in the last couple of questions, Silicon Valley, Utah. I think a lot of the attendees at this conference are based in Europe because we co-sponsor this conference with our German partner Speed Invest. They're in Berlin right now. What any thoughts on dealing with companies? There's obviously time zone issues if you're going to cover a company that's based in Europe, but anything you're particularly interested in Europe, or any tips you would give to companies based there as far as getting, because I think a lot of those companies want to get coverage in the US, partly because if you're a B2B company, this is where your market is and this is where you want to sell in large
markets. That's so hard. I am going to just, like, if you're a US based reporter, covering Europe is hard for sure. Because the US, my audience is largely US based. And I personally have a special interest in Asia and China because I am currently in Hong Kong. A lot of my family's out here, but I found that those kinds of stories get less traction because Americans tend to be really America-centric. So I'm American, so I could say that. So the challenge then is we definitely write about like European startups, but it then always ends up being kind of what is the US tilt to it. So one angle, for example, that's been popping up a lot recently is European startups that are, to your point, right, expanding into the US. That's a big point. In particular, the grocery delivery startups that are taking over, like Gorillas. And so there are ways to do it. It's just, unfortunately, it is an upwards climb if you're not in America. The other way of, if you have a breakout hit of a company like a Spotify or a Mojang, if you're the first ever startup to hit unicorn status in your particular country in Europe, maybe that will definitely get more traction. The other thing I would say is like there's an easier in, which is just find your Europe-based the Europe-based reporter. So Fortune has Europe-based, a lot of great Europe-based reporters. There's
everybody does
on the list.
Yes. Yeah, like TechCrunch does, the Wire services do. And I think that's great advice, right? Because those people are in country and they're probably already closer to your market and might have heard.
Exactly. And their stories are going to reach the US either way. There's definitely ways to do it. There's definitely ways.
Sounds good. All right. Well, I think we're out of time. This has been really instructive. And I guess your message, it's a tough market. There's more PR people and more startups than there are reporters, but a great story, well thought through, delivered authentically, will break through.
Yes. Oh my God. You should just speak for me. I don't even need to be here.
Oh my gosh. Not true at all. All right. Well, good luck with the rest of your quarantine. I'm very excited that you're going to get out of that hotel room after almost 3 weeks.
Oh, thank you so much.
Okay.
Amazing. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thanks, Lucinda.